So this is kind of my presentation I've made called Orwellian Writing or Training in the English Language, Part 1. There's no current plans for Part 2, just it's open-ended. So intro. So I'm going to talk a bit about politics and the English language, which was an essay by George Orwell. And then specifically, we're going to talk about some topics, uh, these being birthing metaphors, and then KISS, which is looking at short words, sentence length, and operators. And then finally, at the end, a bit about being kind to yourself. So it's in trying to implement this stuff, but not beating yourself over it. So what is politics and the English language? So this was a 1946 essay by George Orwell, which talked about the decline of the English language had political and economic reasons in his eyes. His tips specifically focused on political writing, and so I've kind of interrogated the essay and devised useful advice for educational writing. And so his 6 rules were: number 1, never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you're used to seeing in print. Number 2, never use a long word where a short one will do. Number 3, if it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. Number 4, never use the passive where you can use the active. Number 5, never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. And number 6, break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. And so, of course, this was for political writing. It might not all be super applicable to our scientific educational writing. Well, let's talk about birthing metaphors. So metaphors. So metaphors are a figure of speech, frequently comparing or likening one thing to another. And there are 3 different types, as by George Orwell: dead metaphors, dying metaphors, and what I like to call birthed metaphors. And so dead metaphors, these are parts of the normal English language, phrases like iron resolution, fly off the handle, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. These are like actual part of our English language, which directly elicit the thought or concept. And so they don't elicit any imagery or emotions, generally speaking. And these are fine to use as they are part of the normal English language. Then there are dying metaphors. So these are not ingrained in the English language, but they're commonly used so they don't elicit the emotion or imagery to their reader, just like white noise. And so I just did a metaphor there. Did that elicit an image to you? Did you see white noise in your head? However, one thing George Orwell doesn't mention is that dying metaphors can and they do die and become dead metaphors. And so some examples of dying metaphors George Orwell gives back in 1946 are toe the line or axe to grind. And so I think these are part of the English language now. So kind of an interesting thing I thought of when reading the essay, that he's very much saying don't use dying metaphors, but the fact people do use them, eventually they do die and become dead metaphors. But not all of them, of course. And so finally, the one he kind of focuses on is new metaphors, or what I like to call birthed metaphors. And so these are metaphors that you, the writer, have created. They elicit imagery. They can strengthen the theme or aesthetic of your work. You can use them to target your audience, and birth metaphors if you want to be creative. And so this is kind of talking about it in kind of a literary use. And here's what I like to call the metaphority ward. So here's some metaphors I've created, and hopefully they elicit some imagery, and you can see how effective or not they are. But the ones I've made are: he was greeted as warmly as a rooster in the city. She inserted herself into the group like a glass shard amongst the dishes. The rework of the decor had the same effect as tipexing the lines of a new coloring book. Or he was as deep and layered as a Swiss roll. So hopefully those are somewhat entertaining. Of course, they're kind of out of context, but it's just to kind of give you examples. But what about using metaphors in education? So we're not doing these for a literary purpose. So instead, what we can use them for is to help explain concepts. So the kind of example a lot of people like to use at the start of genomics is that genome assembly is like a jigsaw. And so, yeah, that can be very useful to kind of give you that concept. So the tips I like to give about using metaphors in education is to compare difficult concepts to universal or culturally relevant concepts. So yeah, like most people if we're teaching like a British audience, most people kind of understand what a jigsaw is. But you don't want to like use confusing analogies. So like in one of my examples, I had a teacher who was teaching us Java, and he was trying to liken it to his C++ knowledge, which none of us knew. But he also then tried to compare it to our Python knowledge, which he didn't know. And so it became more confusing trying to use these concepts because he didn't know how to use them properly. Don't be afraid to use metaphors others use. Your students are new to the topic. So although I've been talking about you don't want to use dying metaphors or dead metaphors, the fact that your students a lot of the time will be new to this topic means that using a metaphor like genome assembly is like a jigsaw means a lot that'll be new to them. And so there's no issue in using something that might be dead to you, but new to them. Another one I like to do is using multiple metaphors for one concept. If you think or find that some learners find the concept difficult. So if any of you have taught Linux, whenever one of the big things to teach for newcomers is Linux paths, so paths to directories and files, and that can be quite hard to talk about. So I like to show the kind of like the tree structure of paths, where you've got your root and then it kind of branches off and becomes subdirectories and subdirectories. And then on top of that, I like to talk about it as its boxes. So you have the root being your big box. Within that box, you have other boxes, which are subdirectories. Those subdirectories have boxes, etc. And so that kind of having like multiple metaphors, one after the other can be helpful. And of course, since we're making teaching materials and we're not writing books, we can use imagery with our metaphors. So with the example of the Linux kind of tree root structure, you can kind of make a diagram showing, you've got your root and then branches off, or with the boxes, you can actually like show boxes with your root directory, your subdirectories of that. And so kind of having that verbal explanation along with the visual imagery can be very useful. And of course, making metaphors is hard, and especially hard to make up on the spot. So that's why it can be good to write these as materials, because then trying to make up metaphors whilst you're teaching in person live can be very difficult. And so we're going to go to our first activity, and this is what I call the Metaphornity board activity. So you're going to have about 5 to 10 minutes. You're going to think up some concepts and create matching analogies. No need to write anything super in-depth. So an example would be, you might say genome assembly, a jigsaw puzzle. Or another example is, if you're talking about the central dogma, you have DNA to RNA to protein. Transcription, you could liken to writing verbal instructions to written instructions. So DNA to RNA. And then translation, you could liken to following written instructions to build something. And so if everyone goes to our ELIXIR kind of training club playbook, you'll see at the left side here, we have Orwellian writing, and then we have our Metaphornity word page. So here you've got some examples. You're kind of working one-on-one. If you want to help each other or have questions of me, that's grand, but you can like start writing in your attendee input some examples. So I've got, examples here, and then I've got possible concepts that you can kind of use. And so, I'll give you till about 20 past, and then we can kind of look at some of them. Oh, I like that. Someone's put down looking at single cell analysis. You can compare that to a choir, and that we are looking at the individual parts, so not the overall song. So I like that one. I've not heard that one before, so that's cool. We've got a genome index, is like a book index. If, say, in a molecular biology textbook, you want to find where the word plasmid occurs, it would be very time-consuming to have to read the book start to finish to find where the word occurs. Having an index in the book makes this process very fast. Similarly, the process of genome indexing makes the tools that use the index be more efficient, for example, aligning reads to a genome. Very nice. I assume that was from your materials, because I could see it was copy and pasted, but that's grand. If anybody has any materials they can easily find kind of some written metaphor, then please feel free to add that in if you like. Someone's put down the directories, which could be the paper or plastic wallets you keep your documents in. That's a good one. One of my ones I actually have. My third one is about a file storage building where the root directory is the building itself. Then the subdirectories could be the rooms. Then subdirectories of that are the big filing blocks, and then you have folders, and then you have documents. Someone's put down importance of non-coding region of genome. The genome is like a recipe book. Protein coding genes are the actual recipes, the steps to make a cake. The non-coding regions are notes in the margins or section headings to separate mains and desserts. Without these parts, you have recipes still, but you wouldn't know how and when to use them, where to find. So the non-coding region doesn't make the dish, but controls how, when, how well the dish is made. Very nice. I like that too. With the recipe type thing again, it's script slash piece of code is a sequence series of instructions on how to do X, like the method in a recipe. Yeah, that reminds me of one of my analogies. One of the analogies somebody made was a loop, saying about how you would make boiled potatoes, where you would peel potatoes, put in the pot, and then if you weren't to use the loop, you would have to do peel potato, put in pot, peel potato, put in pot, peel potato, put in pot. Whereas when you're doing the loop, you can just do peel potato, put in pot, and then you go back to the start and you just keep on doing that for boiling potatoes. If you're the type of person to peel your potatoes, which I like the potato skin, so I tend to leave it on. And then we've got about 1 minute left. What other analogies can we see? Programs, databases, and file structures are tools in a toolkit, like a spanner, hammer, screwdriver. Choose the right ones for the task. Brilliant. So I like that one. And an epigenetic switch is like a railway switch. Great. Well, that's 20 past now. So thanks everyone for your input. I really like the analogies. Hopefully everyone's fine with anybody else using them. And these will be kind of, put your own spin on them, hopefully. But I think, yeah, this is a nice resource for people to have. So let's go back to the slideshow. We'll have one more activity later on. So that was the activity. And here's my own analogy. So this is kind of what I have in a presentation where I'm talking about R community analysis. This is my bog rarefaction analogy where I'm talking about rarefaction normalization. So let's say we have a quadrat sampling of peatlands. We have 3 teams, 3 bogs, 1 team per bog, and varying levels of recording. So here's our team and results. We have the eager beavers in Delamere Forest with 1,000 quadrat records. We have the apathetic otters in Kielder Forest with 500 quadrat records, and the demotivated capybaras in New Forest with 5 quadrat records. And then when we verify the results, we choose a rarefaction size of 500. The eager beavers, we take a random sample of 500 records. The apathetic otters, we keep all 500 records because our rarefaction size is 500. So we keep all 500. And for the demotivated capybaras, we remove the results as the number is lower than the chosen rarefaction size. If the science there doesn't make sense, that's fine. This is kind of giving an example of how I like to use metaphors to kind of explain a topic. Hopefully that is somewhat helpful. Super. So let's continue on to KISS. So this is a term that stands for keep it simple, stupid. So it's not supposed to be derogatory. It's just supposed to be a bit funny. But in essence, KISS covers these 3 below rules by George Orwell, which is never use a long word where a short one will do. If it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. And never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. And of course, these won't always apply to what we're going to do, but we'll talk about that as well. So short words are good. So what I like to say is we're not teaching English, so we don't need to teach long English words. And so using short words helps reduce barriers to learning through your writing. Your learning materials are not journal articles. So unfortunately, when I was taught to write journal articles, you're taught to write in a specific way, which is not really a nice thing to actually read. And so we want to go for conciseness over verbosity. There was this paper, which was called Consequences of Erudite Vernacular Utilized Irrespective of Necessity, i.e. problems with using long words needlessly. And this found that readers reading journal articles find those that write clearly and simply to be more intelligent than those who actually write long words. And I think part of that is because once you get into a field more, you kind of can explain things better, you know how to use the right words. Whereas if you're a bit more introductory and writing journal papers, sometimes you might be worried about coming off looking smart. And so sometimes people end up using long words to look smarter than they think they are, I guess is one of the ways. But it's just one of those things, learning and getting better. And so some short word utilities. So instead of using at the present time, you could use now. Instead of using utilize, you could use. Instead of exemplary, you could use great. Instead of demonstrated, shown. And instead of hippopotamonstro-esquipedalophobia, you could say fear of long words. That's what it stands for. However, there is a defense to using long words. So for us, we're teaching science, so scientific jargon is actually useful and needs to be taught and used. If we're constantly speaking using simple words when we're talking about bioinformatics or biology or genomics, we're going to be tripping over ourselves all the time. And it's a lot better to use jargon for a lot of the time. But it is easy to be blind to words we regularly use. And another reason we might want to use longer words is we want to use other words to not overuse a specific word. So for an example, I say use exemplary instead of great. But if you end up using the word great lots of times, it's actually better to then use like synonyms of great. So if you had, like 1,000 words and use the word great 10 times in it, it might be better to go through, keep maybe a couple instances of the word great, but then to make sure that, especially if it's one sentence after another, which has two of the same words, it'd be better to kind of change that up. And it's definitely, whenever I was getting more into writing, I would notice I'd read back through things, I'll go, I've used that word multiple times. I really need to change things up. Another important thing to try and do is to vary your sentence length, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then with science especially, longer words or phrases can be more exact. So a base is not the same thing as a nucleotide, even though we sometimes use them synonymously. They are different things. And so when we're teaching, it's not the same as a coding region, the same way that book is not literature, even though sometimes these can be used interchangeably. And when you're talking about certain things, but when you're teaching them or you need to be exact, you need to use these words properly. A lot of time, people don't like pedants, but when you're teaching, being a pedant is very important. Varied sentence length. So this wasn't a George Orwell thing, but I think it's a good thing to add. So this is that long sentences are exhausting. Inside Gov UK actually keeps 25 words as their limit. And so breaking up a sentence into two can be beneficial, with varying length being the best. This helps create rhythm. Short sentences for impact, pace, and emphasis. Short, probably less than 7 words. Medium length for the normal, so 7 to 15 words, or maybe, and then longer sentences for detailed explanation and flow. I'll need to drink some water for this next part because this is Gary Provost. He has this really nice example of where having varied sentence length is nice. So this is, each sentence is colored based on the sentence length. So let me read through this. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes when I'm certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this, it is important. So write with a combination of short, medium, and long sentences. Create a sound that pleases the reader's ear. Don't just write words, write music. So I think that's a really nice one, and definitely something I find like maybe 10 or so years ago, and definitely affected how I decided to write. One thing I do is I write a lot of my materials in Markdown, so I like to have each sentence be on a new line, and that kind of gives me a nice visual um, indicator of like varied sentence length. Does anyone have any questions about anything up to this point? Okay, great. So let's talk about operators or false or verbal false limbs. These are described as phrases of a noun slash adjective tacked onto a general purpose verb. And this is to, at least according to George Orwell, to pad out sentences to give appearance of symmetry. So examples he gives are render inoperative, mitigate against, have the effect of. So he doesn't really like these. Instead, he likes to use simple verbs like break, stop, spoil, mend. So here's an example. So here's something I've written which has these verbal false operators in them. And so I'll read this out. To carry out the comparison of diversity between samples, the bias inherently caused by sampling deaths cannot be left out of account. The process of rarefaction can be utilized to serve this purpose. Rarefaction has the effect of reducing all samples to the same sequence count by means of random subsampling of the sequence counts. Again, this is quite a complex thing to talk about, but you may have noticed there are some false limbs here, but I think it reads okay. But let's point out where these false limbs are. So we have to carry out the comparison of, left out of account, the process of rarefaction, utilized to serve this purpose, has the effect by means of. So I've kind of rewritten this. In fact, to be perfectly honest, I had written the nice version and I added false limbs for this example, but let's pretend I did it the other way around. So I edit this to make it shorter, and it becomes, to compare the diversity between samples, we need to account for their different sampling depths. This can be carried out with rarefaction. Rarefaction is performed by reducing all the samples to the same sequence count by random subsampling of the sequences. So it gives the same information, but it's shorter. I've edited it a lot, and therefore, because there's less reading to do, that leaves more cognitive capacity for people to keep on learning and teaching. So the less words people have to read, the more they're able to, more concepts they can learn, the more they can get through the materials. Another one I like to do a lot is when listing anything, I use bullet points. So an example here is the 4 nucleotide bases are adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. And instead that becomes the 4 nucleotide bases are adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine. And so it's generally nicer to read, but also it makes things a lot easier to reference. And especially one of the handy things about bullet points is you can then have a colon and then kind of have descriptions about each thing. And instead of then having a big long paragraph where you're listing out different stuff, we have nice bullet points because we're able to use bullet points in teaching materials. Again, we're not writing like literature, or we're not writing books and novels. We are making teaching materials. And so we have this activity, which I've called Kiss and Abstract. And this is a harder one, so let's have a look. So in this case, we're going to find an abstract of a paper and rewrite it to make it clearer. And so do this as if you were like getting this abstract and then writing it for teaching materials. So if we go back to the playbook, we have Kiss and Abstract. I have an example here of this abstract, which I then made into this. So I'll let you read this. And please, if anybody has any questions, read that as an example, and then find a random abstract. Don't be too fussy. Like spend less than a minute finding an abstract of a paper, and then rewrite it to something that's a bit easier. Trying to use some of these tips and tricks. And if you want to look at this presentation, you can go to Orwellian writing, and then you can click the presentation, open it up if you want to like reference anything on that. But yeah, I would recommend writing your rewritten abstract in a separate document or notepad and then copying and pasting in here. Or you can claim a place here if you want to then put down, something like this to claim a place. But yeah. Okay, about one more minute. I can see a lot of work has been put in, so thanks everyone for your effort thus far. And yeah, there's not too much left of the presentation once I start again in about a minute's time. But yeah, hopefully, again, and I've noticed one person saying, it's already so compact, so it's quite hard to do, and that's perfectly grand. Sometimes it might be a few minor changes or big changes. And yeah, obviously some abstracts are easier to condense even further than others. See my one, I pretty much I mainly changed from lists in the paragraph to bullet points, although there are some other minor changes as well. But yeah, let's continue on with the presentation, and hopefully this will be a nice resource and you can have a look at each other's ones and see what you think is good. And it was one of those things where writing is very subjective. In fact, let's kind of talk about that point now. Okay. So the final point, after telling you all these things that I think are good and to include, I'm going to finally say to be kind to yourself. So scientific writing does not equal educational writing. So jargon can be useful in science and writing, but writing scientific papers uses many practices bad for other forms of writing. And educational writing is not political writing. So yeah, jargon can be useful in science. A lot of science jargon is derived from other languages. So whereas George Orwell says don't use land languages or other languages, we kind of have to for scientific and educational writing. And one of the things is repeating long words we are teaching is important. We want to, use these long words so that they'll then get used to using it. But of course, we also want to explain what they are. It's one of those things I always find when I'm like, sometimes when I was following lectures, if they start using words I don't understand and they haven't explained, I can then eventually lose track of what they're talking about. And so then if it's not a long lecture and they've used all this jargon that I kind of can't keep up with, by like reaches the half-hour point, I might then completely tune out. And so it's one of those hard things. Of course, when you're with written materials, you can kind of have an appendix at the back or like definitions at the back, or they can, as you say, if you're listening to somebody, you have to keep up with them. Whereas if you're reading something, maybe you don't understand a word, you can look it up or ask somebody a question. And in fact, I think one of the points is it might be good to have a presentation about writing slides and different tips to like writing slides for presentation. But this was more focused on written materials that people would be reading. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's pretty much the kind of be kind to yourself bit. And so a bit of recap, we're talking about the essay politics and the English language, looked at birthing metaphors, and then the KISS, keep it simple, stupid, which looked at short words, sentence length, and operators. And then finally, be kind to yourself. I'm giving you all these tips, but I'm not expecting you to become expert writers possibly ever in your lifetime. But hopefully some of these tips, even if one or two of them you find very useful and you start to implement them, and then if you're comfortable using them, include one. I think for me, again, the biggest writing tip I found was the whole varied sentence length and trying to keep sentences short, and bullet points are nice too. And then you can kind of build up and build up. You don't, if you're new to all these tips I've given, definitely don't try and use them all and implement them all at one time. But yeah, so yeah, some citations at the end, not too many, but yeah, thanks for listening. And I hope you all find that interesting and useful.